Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This video uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. And today we're diving into the second founding, how the Civil War and Reconstruction remade the Constitution by Foner. It's a deep dive into the era after the Civil War, roughly 1865 to 1877, and really how it shaped, the America we live in today. Did you know the U.S. Constitution had a second founding? What happens when the very meaning of freedom is up for debate, and how did ordinary citizens, not just politicians, change the Constitution?
Well, it's fascinating. Foner really argues that the Reconstruction era wasn't just about piecing the country back together, but a fundamental redefining of what it meant to be American.
Yeah, that's what I found so gripping about this book. He focuses on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These are the Reconstruction Amendments, right? And they aim to transform America by abolishing slavery, granting citizenship and equal protection, and securing voting rights for African Americans.
Yeah.
But were they successful?
Well, the book really explores the complexities, and the pushback these amendments faced. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, which seems, pretty straightforward. But there's this exception clause that allowed for involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime.
Wait, what? That sounds like a huge loophole. How could they overlook something like that?
Yeah, it wasn't a major concern initially, but as you can imagine, it had serious consequences later on. Think convict leasing in the South, where prisoners, disproportionately black, were leased out for forced labor.
So basically slavery by another name. It's chilling to see how this connects to issues we still face today.
Yeah.
Mass incarceration, exploitation of prison labor. It makes you wonder, how much did things really change?
That's the question, right? That's the question Foner keeps asking. Now, the 14th Amendment aimed to establish equal citizenship for African Americans. But defining what privileges and immunities of citizens actually meant caused all sorts of legal battles.
Oh, I can imagine. It seems like, the courts could easily twist that language to suit their own agenda.
Exactly. One striking example is the Bradwell v. Illinois case in 1873. Where the Supreme Court actually upheld a state law preventing women from practicing law. They argued it wasn't a privilege of citizenship.
Wow, that's infuriating. So much for equal protection. It's clear that these amendments, while groundbreaking, didn't magically solve everything. Which brings us to the 15th Amendment, granting black men the right to vote. It feels like a major step forward, but I'm guessing it wasn't that simple.
You're right. Even among those who supported ending slavery, there were fierce debates about voting rights. Some radical Republicans pushed for universal suffrage, regardless of race or gender, while others were more hesitant. And it created a huge rift in the women's suffrage movement.
I can see why. It's progress, but it leaves some people out.
Absolutely. Some women saw it as a stepping stone, believing that black men gaining the vote would pave the way for women's suffrage. Others were deeply disappointed, even angry, that the amendment explicitly excluded them. It highlights the complicated intersection of race and gender in the fight for equality. And that tension, it continues today in our own debates about voting rights and accessibility.
It's fascinating to think about how these seemingly, historical events still ripple through our society today. Foner really brings that to life. He talks about the huge celebrations when the 15th Amendment was ratified, parades with thousands of people, a real sense of hope and victory. But he contrasts that with the anger and disappointment felt by many women's rights advocates. It must have been a really turbulent time.
It was. And the second founding shows us that the Supreme Court had a huge role to play in all of this. Foner argues that many of the court's early rulings actually chipped away at the power of these amendments.
So they were basically undermining the progress they were supposed to guarantee.
In many ways, yes. Cases like the civil rights cases of 1883, for example, significantly narrowed the scope of the Reconstruction Amendments. It's a stark reminder that even the most groundbreaking legal changes can be rolled back or reinterpreted.
That's a sobering thought. It seems like this second founding was just the beginning of a very long and complicated journey. To quickly recap, we have the 13th Amendment, ending slavery but with that troubling loophole. The 14th Amendment, aiming for equal citizenship but facing roadblocks. And the 15th, granting black men the right to vote but causing divisions, and raising questions about who gets included in the promise of equality.
And the key takeaway here, Reconstruction wasn't a neat and tidy event. It was messy, complex, and full of contradictions. And it's crucial to understand this era if we want to make sense of the issues we still grapple with today.
You're absolutely right. This book is more than just a history lesson. It's a lens through which we can view our own present. And to our listeners, I can't recommend The Second Founding enough.
Yeah, it's crucial to understand the historical context surrounding these amendments.
Huh.
The social and political upheaval that shaped them.
Yeah, you can't just look at the words on paper. It was such a turbulent time, right?
Yeah.
Right after the Civil War, with so many clashing views on how to move forward.
That's what Foner captures so well. The heated debates in Congress, the clashing ideologies, even within the Republican Party. There was a spectrum of opinions on how to rebuild the nation. It wasn't simply a North versus South divide.
I'm curious about those different factions. Who were the key players? What were they fighting for?
Well, you had the radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner pushing for sweeping change, full equality for African Americans, no compromises. They saw the Civil War as a chance to truly reshape American society.
That sounds intense.
They were. Then you had the more moderate Republicans, more cautious about pushing too far, too fast, worried about alienating white Southerners or even sparking more violence. It was a delicate balancing act, rebuilding the nation while guaranteeing the rights of newly freed people.
And that tension played out in the language of the amendments themselves, and even more so in their implementation, right? It's like that we're setting the stage for future battles over equality.
Exactly. Take voting rights, for example. Initially, many Republicans were hesitant to fully embrace black suffrage, even some of the radicals.
Really? But isn't that the core of the 15th Amendment? What were their concerns?
It's important to remember that most states at the time had all sorts of restrictions on voting, not just based on race. Property qualifications, literacy tests, things like that. And some, even abolitionists, argued that formerly enslaved people needed education and time to prepare for citizenship before being granted the vote.
That sounds incredibly patronizing to our modern ears.
It does, but it was a common sentiment at the time. It took time and a lot of pressure for black suffrage to gain widespread support, even within the Republican Party.
And I imagine that pressure came from African Americans themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
They weren't just passively waiting for rights to be granted.
Absolutely. Foner makes it clear that black people were active agents in shaping Reconstruction. Conventions, petitions, tireless advocacy for their rights, they forced the government's hand. And that's where those celebrations come in, the parades and jubilant gatherings we talked about earlier.
Right, a powerful expression of black joy and political power.
Exactly. But, as we mentioned before, this period also saw deep disappointment felt by many women's rights advocates. The 15th Amendment didn't include women.
Right, it was a victory for black men, but it sparked this furious debate within the women's movement.
Some, like Lucy Stone, believed supporting black suffrage was a step toward universal suffrage. Others, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, felt betrayed, accusing abolitionists of prioritizing black men over women. And that tension between focusing on race or gender in the fight for equality has continued to echo through history.
A reminder that progress is rarely a straight line.
Exactly. And Foner doesn't shy away from those messy realities of Reconstruction. He shows how, even as the amendments were being ratified, powerful forces were working to undermine their impact. The Supreme Court played a crucial role in this.
You mentioned before how the court narrowed the scope of the Reconstruction amendments. It's amazing how a few judges can have such a massive impact.
Foner dedicates a whole chapter to the court's role. Many of their rulings essentially gutted the original intent of the amendments.
It's like they rewrote the Constitution without actually changing the words.
You could say that. And that's why Foner's book is so powerful. He connects those legal battles to the lived experiences of real people, showing how the struggle for equality continued long after Reconstruction. It's not just a dry history book. It's a call to action.
It challenges us to think critically about the meaning of equality and how we can truly live up to those ideals. Our listeners are probably eager to hear more about those crucial Supreme Court cases and their lasting impact. Let's explore that further.
Absolutely. Understanding these cases provides valuable insight into the ongoing struggle for civil rights in America.
So before the break, we were talking about how the Supreme Court, really narrowed the scope of these Reconstruction amendments. It's kind of crazy how a handful of judges can have such a huge impact on, history and the lives of, millions of people.
Yeah, the power of judicial interpretation is immense. And in this case, their decisions had a ripple effect, shaping the legal landscape for generations.
So let's dive into some specific cases. You mentioned the civil rights cases of 1883, I think, earlier. Could you remind me of what happened there?
Well, this case revolved around the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It was a landmark law prohibiting racial discrimination in public spaces like hotels, theaters, and transportation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. That sounds like a pretty straightforward attempt to guarantee, equal citizenship.
It was. But the Supreme Court struck down key parts of the act. They argued that the 14th Amendment only prohibited discrimination by state governments, not by, private individuals or businesses.
Hold on. So the court said that private businesses could discriminate. That doesn't sound very equal.
Yeah, it was a huge setback for civil rights. This ruling essentially opened the door for widespread segregation, particularly in the South, as businesses were no longer legally required to serve Black customers.
So the dream of equal citizenship was dealt a serious blow. How did people respond to this?
Well, it was a bitter pill to swallow. But the fight didn't end there, Foner highlights how Black activists, legal scholars, community leaders, they continued to challenge these rulings. They offered alternative interpretations of the Reconstruction amendments and pushed for change through, grassroots organizing.
So they refused to accept the court's interpretation as like the final word. Mm-hmm. It's kind of inspiring to see how, they kept fighting for their rights.
Their resilience is remarkable. They understood that the meaning of the Constitution, it isn't static. It's constantly evolving through interpretation and struggle.
What a powerful reminder that we, the people, right, have a role to play in shaping the meaning of our founding documents. Mm. So what can we learn from the second founding? What lessons can we apply to the challenges that we face today?
Well, one key takeaway is that the fight for equality, it's a marathon, not sprint. It demands sustained effort, legal expertise, and an unwavering commitment from individuals and communities.
Yeah, it's about, long-term systemic change, not just, quick fixes.
Exactly. And we need to be wary of seemingly neutral laws or policies that can have, discriminatory effects.
Like those seemingly race-neutral voting restrictions that are still being debated today.
Yes. Foner's book reminds us to be vigilant, and constantly scrutinize the ways power operates and challenge inequalities wherever we see them.
It's about connecting the dots between, the past and the present, understanding how history shapes, the issues that we face today.
Absolutely. And recognizing that the fight for equality is an ongoing process, one that requires our attention and action.
This has been an incredible journey exploring, the second founding. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the Reconstruction era and its, lasting impact.
It's a book everyone should read, especially now.
It's a must read for sure. Folks, if you haven't already, grab a copy of The Second Founding by Eric Foner. You can find a link to purchase it in the description below.
And be sure to subscribe to Mindful Moments for more, insightful book analyses and thought-provoking discussions.
We're releasing new deep dives every week, so hit that subscribe button and stay tuned. We'll leave you with this question: What does the second founding mean for you in today's world?
Think about it and keep learning and keep questioning.
That's a wrap, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the second founding.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time on Mindful Moments.